Welcome back. In today's video, we're going to take a look at radiant barriers, and specifically I'm going to walk you through my process for how I did a radiant barrier in my house. I've got a 2-car garage, and then I've got an attic space above my second floor. Both of those areas I went through and installed a radiant barrier. I'm going to explain what product I used and some of the things you might want to consider if you're considering doing a radiant barrier for a house. Now, first things first, radiant barrier is not really insulation. So don't expect a radiant barrier to act like an actual insulation upgrade or improvement in insulation. It is not for insulation. So I just wanted to throw that out there. If you're looking for something to improve the insulation of your house, you need to actually look at insulation. Radiant barriers do matter. They do have an impact in some situations, not all situations. But let's go ahead and jump right in and we'll get into the details. Now here is my install, and as you can see, I didn't cover up any of the eaves or any of the soffit vents down here. And then I pretty much did a pretty good job of covering every other area. You don't want to overlap too much also. They say about 1 to 3 inches of overlap on the barrier. And then obviously you want to leave your ridge here open so you've got proper ventilation from the top of the attic or the roof area here. But yeah, as you can see here, I use the attic foil to pretty much do the entire area. Now this is the area above my garage and living room area. So my garage is actually not insulated, as you can see here at the bottom here. And I've got insulation, pretty old insulation that also needs to be replaced here. Now the idea with mine is I wanted to really make sure that I blocked the radiant energy that was coming in and hitting my roof. I've got solar panels, and then I've also got a fairly dark asphalt shingle roof. So this thing absorbs a lot of radiant energy, and this barrier here prevents a lot of that energy from accumulating here. Now on the day that I took this, it was around 90 degrees outside, and as you can see, it's only around 80 degrees when I'm recording this video here. So yes, I did see a little bit of a temperature drop in here, and I've actually got a vent that vents out of here to get the hot air out because it was so hot before. Now it's actually fairly manageable around 80-ish degrees, so much more manageable to be in this space. And it's not necessarily about being in the space. It's much more about just insulating the hot air and trying to keep the hot air out as much as possible. That way, as much hot air won't seep in through the insulation that we've got up here. And I might actually complete this out so the entire garage and the living space are both insulated when I do the insulation repair here and remove and replace all this insulation that's in here. But the idea is you're trying to keep as much of the hot air out of here so that you lessen the amount of hot air that's getting into your house through the gaps and holes in the productive area there. Now, as I said, I used attic foil, and the link is in the description, and on any of my videos, and I generally keep all the links in all my videos. If we go ahead and scroll down here, where this attic foil is if you come into this Amazon storefront right here and you click that, you'll see everything that I used for this install. So if we click on the attic foil group here, this is all the equipment that I used. You are going to be working, if you're doing this yourself, up in the attic. So I would recommend, I hit my head more times than I can count. I did have one of these things on here. Plus there's lots of nails sticking through, especially if you've got solar installed. There's even larger screws through some of the things that miss the studs. So you're constantly possibly hitting these nails and screws up on your attic or roof line there. So I highly recommend that if you're going to do this yourself, that you get one of these. Same thing with the suit. Now, I didn't have this for the first day, and pretty much all the clothes that I wore up into the attic were kind of garbage clothes anyway. Obviously, you're working in a pretty dirty area. But at the end of this, you're pretty much going to throw it away. And I think that the clothes that I wore under this, when I finally did pick this up on the second day that I was working on this, I didn't have to throw those clothes away. There was a problem with the insulation getting into the clothes, and it was like a constant scratching afterwards. So I wore even less stuff, threw one of these things on there. I don't have any kids in the house, so I didn't have to worry too much about it. And then use this the second day. Much more comfortable experience, I would say, using this. And then you're going to want to definitely have something for a breathing mask of some sort. This is what I used, was this one here. This was amazing. I love this thing. And I didn't have this on the first day either, But when I was constantly putting things down, picking things up, and I realized it would be a lot more helpful if I had a tool belt. So I went out and bought a tool belt, and this thing was awesome. I had pretty much all the tools right there. I had the tape, I had the scissors to cut the tape, and I had pretty much everything right there with me. So I wasn't constantly picking things up and putting things down. So I can't recommend this enough if you're going to be doing this yourself. Even though it's only a couple days, it really does make the experience a lot better. And then you'll want to have some sort of utility knife. And I went through about 5 blades with this utility. What you don't realize when you're doing this is when you're cutting this tape, there's a lot of glue on the tape and it happens to stick to this. So it gets all gummed up pretty quick, actually. So if you want to keep that razor nice and sharp, you're going to want to swap this out a couple times. And then also if you retract this and you're extending it all the time, that glue gets into here and it just causes a lot of issues. Now, I also had a scissors, and for the scissors, I had the same problem. The glue was constantly sticking to the scissors after time, and I had to keep scraping the stuff off there. And then I just had a digital tape measure. This thing was awesome where I could just kind of put it on the wall and measure the total length that I was going to need for these rolls. And then I ended up getting 3 or 4 rolls of this. Now, I ended up getting a bunch of the 48-inch. In retrospect, what I probably should have done is done a better job of measuring my rafters. One of them should have been a 48-inch in between, and then probably a 36-inch maybe would have worked a little bit better. So if I would pair it up a 48 versus a 36, I might have had to cut a little bit less off of this because I was constantly having to trim a little bit. So if I'd done a little bit better job measuring and approximating about how much I was going to have, I really just was trying to minimize some of that overlap. Again, you're only supposed to have a little bit of an overlap, anywhere from like 1 to 3 inches. But I had quite a bit of overlap, so I had to cut some of that down a little bit. And I'd bought mostly just this 48-inch wide, thinking that was going to work fine. And again, the price here for this, now you have a lot of different options. 1,500 square feet. I went with 1,000 square feet on the first roll, and I kind of figured out how long this is going to last. I mean, I could have done all the math and kind of figured it out, but I didn't want to overbuy, and I didn't end up with any real excess. We've got a little bit of extra just because I only needed a part of that last roll, but I probably should have considered getting a 48-inch, and then they've got different widths here. So I think 36 inches is another option that they've got, and that would have been probably helpful there. You will need a lot of staples. And if we go back over here, this stapler was awesome, but I did go through quite a lot of staples. So I would definitely plan for quite a few staples, depending on the size of your install. But this is essentially everything that I needed to do this radiant barrier. It's a really easy process, as long as you don't mind crawling around your attic. That's the only hard part about the entire thing, is trying to get down and not falling through. Obviously, that's a challenge as well, but it really isn't super complicated, especially for, I think I was quoted somewhere between $5,000 and $8,000 to do this a couple of years ago. And it's basically aluminum foil, and I couldn't get over the cost. And I want to say that my all-in was around $800 or $900 for everything. Now you can see I went through a couple rolls of this, so that was about $600 there. And then I had to buy pretty much everything that was in here. I didn't have some of this equipment. I did have this, so I didn't have to really buy that. But pretty much everything else in here I had to buy. So, and then I already had the utility knife, obviously. So it wasn't too crazy for doing this entire project, under $1,000 to do everything. All right, so the rest of this, we're going to talk about who is this best for and what are some considerations. The things we're going to cover are, where's the radiant barrier the most help, and where are they less helpful, and then ventilation, moisture considerations, and then should you do a DIY or should you do a contractor? Clearly, I've already given you a little bit of a preview of what one of the considerations for that might be. But one of the primary things I want to do is provide you information on things that might help you understand whether you should do a radiant barrier or not do one. Now, don't forget, if you like this kind of content, hit that like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow and get out to other people that might find this content interesting. So where are radiant barriers the biggest help? If you live in a hot, sunny climate, now I'm in Fairfax, Virginia area, and we do get a lot of sun, so it is a great environment around here to install this. If you have a vented attic, for example, mine vents out of the top here, so that makes my attic a good option for doing a radiant barrier. If you've got ductwork or HVAC, now in my case, I don't have the HVAC up there, but I do have ductwork. So again, I've got 3 check marks here for my particular setup. If I've got upstairs rooms that get hot, and I actually do have this issue, my upstairs is typically somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees difference from the lower levels. And now that I've got that radiant barrier, I can actually feel the difference going upstairs versus downstairs, where there isn't as much of a difference in temperature. Now, part of that might also be the geothermal install, but I tend to think that the radiant barrier is also helping with that. Now, if your roof is in a shaded area, then there's probably a solid argument that maybe a radiant barrier wouldn't be as helpful for you. If you've got a lot of sun exposure on your roof, or it's an especially dark roof that absorbs a lot of the sun, then you also are a good candidate for a radiant barrier. And then if your home is obviously needing some sort of a comfort boost where you can tell the difference in the temperatures, and like I described in my situation, I can feel the difference now that I've got that radiant barrier. Even just going up into the attic, I can feel the difference between before and now. I actually did the install in October, November timeframe because it would have been too hot earlier in the year to even think about doing something like that. Doing it in October, November timeframe, much cooler outside, much more manageable to get up there and do it. And right now, even like I said, around 90 degrees, and it's only around 80 degrees up there. Before, again, I was kicking all that hot air straight into my garage to try to get it out of there. And my vent fan actually kicks on whenever the temperature is a certain level up there, and it hasn't actually had to work at all since having to do the radiant barrier. Now, when is a radiant barrier less helpful? If you live in a cold climate, you're probably not going to see as much of a change based off of the radiant barrier install. If you got really bad air sealing, you're probably not going to see as much, but this is something you can always fix in the future. Again, like I said, in my situation, I don't necessarily have great air sealing. I've got to do a lot of work to this house to fix some of the air sealing. But my main thing was in the summers, it gets really warm, and I wanted to kind of make the stress on my geothermal system a little bit less by installing that radiant barrier. So it won't have to work quite as hard because not as much hot air is accumulated in the attic spaces that seeps into the rest of the house through those holes that I have. Now, I also, when I was up there, did go through and seal most of the entrances into my actual living space while I was up there. So any kind of wire protrusions, I went through it and sealed. It's just a kind of a band-aid, if you will, but it is a step in the right direction between now and when I actually go through and fix all the insulation that's up there and actually do some proper air sealing. If you've got inadequate insulation, you're probably not going to see a huge difference here. Again, radiant barrier is just one aspect of what should be done inside of your space to kind of insulate you from the outside. But if you've got bad insulation or poor air sealing, you're not going to see as much of an impact. Now, I would say for the cost benefit, around $800-900 for my house. Again, pretty good square footage on the roof area there. I am noticing a difference, even though this is a 1979's house and it has never had an upgrade to its insulation. So it's original insulation, and I am noticing a difference. So I would say that you might not necessarily see a huge impact if you've got really bad insulation or you have really bad holes in your shell here. But I would say that this is a fairly cost-efficient approach. I knew I had to do the insulation, but it's a lot more money to do insulation than it is to do a radiant barrier. So that's kind of a future step. Now, if you've got poor ventilation issues, you can have a lot of issues. So you always want to take a look at your ventilation and make sure your ventilation problems are fixed. Again, I don't know that that would necessarily prevent doing a radiant barrier, but it might be money better spent in other areas is really what this is demonstrating. Is you might want to put money in other areas to see the bigger impact over a radiant barrier. Again, a radiant barrier is not insulation. The only thing is that it's designed to reflect some of that radiant energy back up and out of your vented spaces here. Now, if you don't have your HVAC or any of your ducts inside of the spaces, you might not see as much because, again, if you've got ductwork up here or you've got the HVAC up here, it's constantly being exposed to those temperatures. So as much as you can get that temperature down in there, the better your actual ductwork is going to operate, and you're going to get better air circulation and to keep your house a little bit better cooled. And then if you've got no air gap or wrong assembly, if you put this in wrong, you can do more damage than good. So if you completely insulate this and you've got what's supposed to be a vented roof, it's going to cause a lot of issues for you. So if you install something incorrectly, you can do more damage than good. So you definitely want to make sure that you're doing things correctly. So what are some ventilation and moisture considerations that you should take a look at? First of all, you want to make sure you keep your soffits over here unblocked, so you don't want to cover those up with the radiant barrier when you're putting them in there. And then same thing with your ridge vents. You want to make sure that there is proper ventilation here. So you saw in mine where I kept this area open. You want to make sure that the air still can flow like it's supposed to in your attic. So you don't want to do anything that prevents that airflow from actually venting that air out of there. Same thing if you've got vents for your bathroom fans or something else. You don't want to block those. You want to make sure that they have the abilities to still leave out of there. Now, nothing when you're putting the radiant barrier in should prevent that, but if on the off chance that you find that your attic vents aren't being properly vented out, you might want to get that fixed also. So just keep that in mind, is if you're venting moisture into your attic right now, you might want to fix that before you put the radiant barrier up there. And then after you put the actual radiant barrier in there, you do want to keep an eye on it every once in a while just to make sure that you don't have any moisture or condensation issues that are popping up after you put this in there. That might be an indication that you did something wrong. So you do want to just go up there every once in a while when it's nice and hot outside and check that. And that's part of the reason why I was up there, is just doing a quick check on everything, make sure everything's looking the way that it's supposed to. And in my case, everything is still looking pretty good. And if you can, go ahead and seal major air leaks before you actually put the radiant barrier in there. Now, in my case, I have a brand new roof, so I wasn't going to worry too much about any kind of issues with the roof itself. And then I did go through and air seal and close as many gaps as I could in the living space coverage over on the other side over here. Now, I'm going to actually have a professional installer come in and remove all of my existing insulation, and then also plug up all the air gaps and try to close this off before they put in insulation. So for that, I am going to hire somebody because they've got the right tools. Yes, I could rent some of the stuff, but it's just a lot easier for professionals in this case to actually do the installation. Radiant barrier, like I said, not super difficult, and it doesn't have to be perfect. That's kind of the key thing here. You don't want to do anything obviously wrong. Like if you just cover up everything, that would not be a good idea. But if you observe some basic policies or procedures for how you put in a radiant barrier, you're not going to have any real issues with doing the install, assuming you don't fall through the ceiling or anything like that. That's probably the biggest issue for most people. So now the big question, should you do it yourself or should you hire a contractor? And again, it's really up to whether you can afford it, whether you feel comfortable working up there. So is the attic accessible? Can you actually get up there? I think most attics are accessible, but if you live in a much older house, it might have been much more difficult to get into the attic. And then depending on the design of it, maybe you couldn't have. Most of the houses I've lived in, the attics were pretty accessible. So this is always something I felt comfortable doing. Are you comfortable working in your attic? If you have allergies or health issues, then you might not want to be up in your attic, especially since there are health concerns. You got to wear a ventilator most of the time, or at least you should when you're working around insulation. And if your layout is pretty straightforward, now you saw in the video of mine's pretty straightforward. It wasn't super complicated. Now I will say above my second floor attic, I actually had an antenna installed in there. So at some point when the house was built, obviously we were still using antennas back then, and then switched over to cable. Rather than take the antenna fully out, what they did is they put it into the attic. And apparently they just kind of hid it up there. And I think that was really popular in this area. I talked to some other neighbors and they had that also. But for my case, I took that thing out of there. There are much better options these days for antennas. So that was a challenge, is to disassemble this really large antenna that was taking up pretty much the entire second floor attic space, and get that out of there. So that was definitely a challenge that caused a little bit of delay in my process. A contractor might be better if the attic is difficult or unsafe to get into. Maybe it's really tight, it's just hard to get around up there, and that's something you want to just push out to a contractor so you don't have to worry about it. if there are a lot of obstacles. Now, in the space that I showed a video of, it wasn't too bad on the second floor attic. There was quite a little bit more going on in that particular attic, made it a little bit more challenging to work up there, but it was still pretty manageable. I didn't consider it overly difficult. I didn't have anything too crazy other as soon as I got that antenna out of there. And if you want speed and fewer mistakes, now radiant barrier is not one of those things where it has to be perfect. And I mentioned this before, it does not need to be perfect. And if you watch a lot of videos out there that actually show you going through and install this, and actually Attic Foil has a YouTube channel and they actually show you how to install their product. And I highly recommend, if you go with Attic Foil, you go to their channel and check it out. They are pretty good. I watched most of their videos before I did mine, so I basically answered a lot of my questions about, should it be overhang? And then you can also do an installation where, and this is kind of the example of it doesn't have to be super difficult. You can just lay the attic foil right on the insulation here, and that is a perfectly acceptable way to do the radiant barrier installation. Now, there's obviously better times to do that and worse times to do it, and there's different issues that you run into if you go with that approach. But even that can provide some benefit for radiant coverage. So even that amount of radiant barrier can be helpful. So again, very forgiving as far as the installation process. You can screw up a lot more things doing your installation install than you probably could doing your radiant barrier. Not that there aren't potentially some issues you could run into. Again, you don't want to have massive overhang here because you won't get the ventilation that you're looking for through the perforated foil there if you have a large overlap. But even that, I think, probably is not going to cause a ton of problems. Now, if you doubled it up, that might be an example of where things are not going to go well. So there are some things you could screw up on this. But again, Attic Foil, if you go to their website, go to their YouTube channel, they've got lots of how-to videos on how to actually do this installation. And they'll actually walk you through the entire process. Plus, you can reach out to Attic Foil and ask any questions if you buy the product. And I'm sure they'll be happy to help guide you to make sure that you do this correctly. Now, don't forget, if you like this kind of content, hit that like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. Now, that's pretty much everything for this video. I think probably the question that most people will have is, would I do it again? And the answer is absolutely yes. I would definitely do it again. There are some things I might do a little bit differently. I learned a lot through the process, and this is part of the reason why I would recommend, if you decide to do this yourself, start off with the 1,000-foot roll of the attic foil. When you actually start doing this, you might realize that you don't feel comfortable doing this. And if you try to hire somebody, they may not be willing to use the product that you bought. So maybe start with a smaller amount. And then if you feel comfortable and everything seems to be good, then you can always buy more of everything. And maybe this is more than a 2-week process instead of 1 weekend. Maybe it'll take you 2 weekends to do. But it is a fairly quick process. It's pretty easy to do. So yes, I would absolutely do it again if I was to buy another house in the future and it needed a radiant barrier. All right, I hope you found the content helpful. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time.